Hi everybody, welcome back to my second YouTube video. Thank you so much for joining me. As I mentioned in the very first video, I'm wearing a mask because a couple days after I announced on my podcast, Karla Reads the Classics, that I was going to be starting a YouTube channel today to commemorate the 1-year anniversary of starting the podcast. Just a couple days after making that announcement, I lost a tooth. And it occurred to me to postpone this the video, but the anniversary comes but once a year, so I didn't really want to postpone it. So I asked around and someone said, hey, you could do it with a mask, which I hadn't thought of, and I thought it was a fantastic idea. So you will see my face eventually. It's going to take a couple weeks before I get everything settled with the dentist and everything, and then I'll be continuing to read my favorite chapters and your favorite chapters if you like on this channel. And we'll have a great time with that. In the meantime, the very first book I started, I read when I started the podcast was Somerset Maugham's Of Human Bondage. And as you know, that's a huge book, 122 chapters, so there's so many great chapters in that book. I love the one where Fanny Price writes to Philip after he hadn't seen her in a while, after she quit coming to the art school. I love the one where Mildred just tears everything up in Philip's house. She's so angry with him, I love the one where Philip finally starts to feel a little bit of affection for his Aunt Louisa. So there's so many great chapters, but the one that I want to focus on today for my favorite chapter is 106, where Philip is very dejected. He's near suicidal. He's working at a job that he hates. And, he's lost all his friends. He doesn't want to see any of his friends because he's embarrassed, by what his life has come to. And he has this encounter on the street where he's trying to avoid an old friend from art school, but he actually does have the encounter, and it leads to something quite remarkable for him. So I won't read that entire chapter, but I'll start where, right after Philip just starts pondering everything. Philip asked himself desperately, what was the use of living at all? It all seemed inane. It was the same with Cronshaw. It was quite unimportant that he had lived. He was dead and forgotten. His book of poems sold in remainder by second-hand booksellers. His life seemed to have served nothing except to give a pushing journalist occasion to write an article in a review. And Philip cried out in his soul, what is the use of it? The effort was so incommensurate with the result. The bright hopes of youth had to be paid for at such a bitter price of disillusionment. Pain and disease and unhappiness weighed down the scale so heavily. What did it all mean? He thought of his own life, the high hopes with which he had entered upon it, the limitations which his body forced upon him, his friendlessness, and the lack of affection which had surrounded his youth. He did not know that he had ever done anything but what seemed best to do, and what a cropper he had come. Other men with no more advantages than he succeeded, and others again with many more failed. It seemed pure chance. The rain fell alike upon the just and upon the unjust, and for nothing was there a why and a wherefore. Sorry. Thinking of Cronshaw, Philip remembered the Persian rug which he had given him, telling him that it offered an answer to his question upon the meaning of life, and suddenly the answer occurred to him. He chuckled. Now that he had it, it was like one of the puzzles which you worry over until you are shown the solution and then cannot imagine how it could have ever escaped you. The answer was obvious. Life had no meaning. On the earth, satellite of a star speeding through space, living things had arisen under the influence of conditions which were part of the planet's history. And as there had been a beginning of life upon it, so, under the influence of other conditions, there would be an end. Man, no more significant than other forms of life, had come not as the climax of creation, but as a physical reaction to the environment. Philip remembered the story of the Eastern king who, desiring to know the history of man, was brought by a sage 500 volumes. Busy with the affairs of state, he bade him go and condense it. In 20 years the sage returned, and his history now was in no more than 50 volumes. But the king, too old then to read so many ponderous tomes, bade him go and shorten it once more. 20 years passed again, and the sage, old and gray, brought a single book in which was the knowledge the king had sought. But the king lay on his deathbed, and he had no time to read even that. And then the sage gave him the history of man in a single line. It was this: he was born, he suffered, and he died. There was no meaning in life, and man by living served no end. It was immaterial whether he was born or not born, whether he lived or ceased to live. Life was insignificant, and death without consequence. Philip exulted, as he exulted in his boyhood when the weight of a belief in God was lifted from his shoulders. It seemed to him that the last burden of responsibility was taken from him, and for the first time he was utterly free. His insignificance was turned to power, and he felt himself suddenly equal with the cruel fate which had seemed to persecute him. For if life was meaningless, the world was robbed of its cruelty. What he did or left undone it did not matter. Failure was unimportant, and success amounted to nothing. He was the most inconsiderate creature in that swarming mass of mankind which for a brief space occupied the surface of the earth. And he was almighty because he had wrenched from chaos the secret of its nothingness. Thoughts came tumbling over in another of Philip's eager fancy, and he took long breaths of joyous satisfaction. He felt inclined to leap and sing. He had not been so happy for months. "O life," he cried in his heart, "O life, where is thy sting?" From the same uprush of fancy which had shown him with all the force of mathematical demonstration that life had no meaning, brought with it another idea. And that was why Cronshaw, he imagined, had given him the Persian rug. As the weaver elaborated his pattern for no end but the pleasure of his aesthetic sense, so might a man live his life. Or, if one was forced to believe that his actions were outside his choosing, so might a man look at his life that it made a pattern. There was as little need to do this as there was use. It was merely something he did for his own pleasure. Out of the manifold events of his life, his deeds, his feelings, his thoughts, he might make a design, regular, elaborate, complicated, or beautiful, and though it might be no more than an illusion that he had the power of selection, though it might be no more than a fantastic legerdemain in which appearances were interwoven with moonbeams, that did not matter. It seemed, and so to him it was. In the vast warp of life, a river arising from no spring and flowing endlessly to no sea, with the background to his fancies that there was no meaning and that nothing was important, a man might get a personal satisfaction in selecting the various strands that worked out the pattern. There was one pattern, the most obvious, perfect and beautiful, in which a man was born, grew to manhood, married, produced children, toiled for his bread, and died. But there were others, intricate and wonderful, in which happiness did not enter and in which success was not attempted, and in them might be discovered a more troubling grace. Some lives, and Hayward's was among them, the blind indifference of chance cut off while the design was still imperfect, and then the solace was comfortable that it did not matter. Other lives, such as Cronshaw's, offered a pattern which was difficult to follow. The point of view had to be shifted, and old standards had to be altered before one could understand that such a life was its own justification. Philip thought that in throwing over the desire for happiness, he was casting aside the last of his illusions. His life had seemed horrible when it was measured by its happiness, but now he seemed to gather strength as he realized that it might be measured by something else. Happiness mattered as little as pain. They came in, both of them, as all the other details of his life came in, to the elaboration of the design. He seemed for an instant to stand above the accidents of his existence, and he felt that they could not affect him again as they had done before. Whatever happened to him now would be one more motive to add to the complexity of the pattern. And when the end approached, he would rejoice in its completion. It would be a work of art, and it would be none the less beautiful because he alone knew of its existence, and with his death, it would cease to be. Philip was happy. And that's the end of chapter 106 of Somerset Maugham's Of Human Bondage, where Philip comes to this realization that life has no meaning. And this offers some solace for him because if you read back through the previous chapters, he, for his entire life, was just so absorbed with the meaning of life, and that he found it here in this chapter for him meant everything. And what it means for him going forward is especially remarkable in this work. So thank you so much for watching this video. If you stuck with me this far, thank you very much. I ask that you like the video. If you do like it, give it a thumbs up, even a thumbs down if you don't, and leave a comment. Tell me what your feeling is about this chapter or another chapter that you might like in this particular book. And if there's something that you would particularly like to hear read, I'd be happy to do that. So let me hear from you. Thank you so much for watching this video. Until next time, bye-bye.